So once again, most welcome to this SweDev seminar. Good morning. We are so delighted to see you here. Today's seminar on increasing the use of research in Swedish development policy and practice. My name is Jesper Sundewall and I'm a researcher at Lund University and University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa. And I'm a member of the SweDev steering committee. And I'm delighted to be the moderator for this seminar, which features an interesting new study and an extremely competent group of people who have taken on the task to discuss its findings. We also hope that you, the audience, are ready to contribute to the discussion and also the way forward, but we will come back to your contributions a bit later. Today's seminar will focus on the role and use of research in Swedish development policy and practice. It marks the launch of a new study from SweDev on this subject. This seminar asks the questions: what contributes to research being picked up in policy? How is research used and when? And how can we decrease the existing gap between research and policy? We're presenting a study that assesses how and when practitioners and policymakers working with development-related issues use research-based knowledge and interact with the development research community. But first, let me just say a couple of words about SweDev. The Swedish Development Research Network is a member-based network that was founded about 2 years ago. We aim to connect development researchers across Sweden in order to strengthen collaboration within the research community and increase interaction between development researchers and practitioners. We seek to support the use of research-based knowledge for efficient policymaking and practice among Swedish actors working for Agenda 2030. We currently have about 160 members, and if you have not yet signed up, please do. It's free of charge. We encourage you to do so at our website, www.swedev.dev. We will have people put the link in the chat so you can see where you sign up. So please go ahead and do so if you haven't. Before we kick off the main act for today, we have a few housekeeping rules. As you might have noted coming in, the session is recorded and will be posted online at the SweDev website after the seminar. If you're interested in asking a question, you could either write the question in the chat or you raise your hand when we get to that. And the study that we are presenting today is available on SweDev's website, and the link for that, if you haven't found it already, will also be shared in the chat. So with that said, and without further ado, it's time for the main act for today, the new study. The title of the study is Increasing the Use of Research in Swedish Development Policy and Practice, and we have two extremely competent authors behind the study, Anna Ioannou and Janet Vähämäki from SweDev, who will present this study. Anna and Janet, the floor is yours, and you have about 10 minutes for your presentation.
Janet, you're muted.
Unmute. Thank you. So, yes, this study has also been reviewed by the SweDev steering committee. How do I click forward here? Okay, so why a study on how practitioners and policymakers perceive and use research? So the main background for this was a previous SweDev report that we did. It's an EBA study from April 2020, where we had 578 researchers responding to a questionnaire, and where they said that the highest priority for them was in fact increased collaboration with practitioners. So there is a high demand from SweDev members, but also the Swedish development researchers to interact more with practitioners. It was also that we had a sense that this research practice interaction is more established in other countries. And this is both in other aid donor countries, where many of the other countries do have specific institutes or some networks that are connected to development cooperation practice, but also that this is a question that we are typically pushing for in development cooperation as such, that should be happening, increased use of research should be happening in developing countries. However, we have not in Sweden yet had networks or programs or institutes that are focusing on development and this use of increased development research in development cooperation. And shortly, how we went about in the study, we had a short literature review on previous literature on barriers and enablers for evidence-based policy making. We conducted an online survey that was sent to several actors in Sweden. We had 131 responses on the questionnaire, and the questionnaire was then complemented with focus groups interviews. We were interviewing 23 persons in total. And now Anna, take over.
Yes, thank you. So what we saw from the interviews and the survey is how policymakers and practitioners perceive research, and that's really, it's perceived as important and relevant to their work, but at the same time, it's perceived as difficult to find, understand, as well as to implement. And oftentimes, research is perceived as separate and a bit distant from the realities of policy and practice on the ground. And this can be seen in the quote we have there below, that from one of the CSO's participants in the focus group discussions, and that's that they are practical and know what, and they want to know what works, and they often perceive research as wanting to dig deeper into a problem, whilst the practitioners want to know more about the solution to that problem. Can change slide there. So what do policymakers and practitioners actually use research for? Well, we saw that it's often for backing decisions that are already made, rather than to actually inform new decisions. And similarly, many of them responded that research is used to often strengthen the accuracy of one's work and arguments that one wants to put forward and such. And it was interesting to see that only 12% of the respondents saw it as something that's expected by management or by one's organization to use research. And we feel that this risks for very useful, but perhaps more critical research to not being used, whilst perhaps more mainstreamed and already agreed upon research is used that doesn't offer perhaps as critical and innovative ideas. Can change slide. Jeanette, could you put it into presenter view also?
Sorry.
Thank you. So we also saw that time and budget is really the main limiting factor for practitioners to use research in their work. And it's often that other responsibilities, such as internal meetings or dialogues with partners and such, is prioritized. And this was reflected in the focus group discussions, as can see in the quote there, from one of the discussions, that it leads not only to management of one's organizations, but it also leads back to donors and the funding of the work that practitioners are doing. And if it was perceived as if Sweden wants to see a closer cooperation between civil society in this case and academia, then it has to be encouraged from the beginning in the planning and also budgeting of the work. Thank you, Janet. Can you change? And we also saw that there's a communication mismatch between how researchers share their work and how practitioners generally find research to use in their work. And for example, researchers mainly communicate through peer-reviewed journals, whilst practitioners, on the other hand, they often search for research using Google, social media, or seminars. So this really creates a gap and a mismatch between how researchers share and how practitioners find the research. Thank you, Jeanette. Can you change slide? Thank you. So we also saw, not so much from the survey, but more the sense we got from the focus group discussions, that many Swedish policymakers and practitioners tend to use more internationally produced research rather than research produced by Swedish affiliated researchers. And there could be several reasons for this. One is, as we saw from the focus group discussions, is that the ownership principle is very valued throughout Swedish development work. One doesn't want to step on partners' toes and wants to really encourage more research from the partner countries. And another reason is that we see is possible for this being the case is that international research organizations, for example, such as ODI, might have a more established reputation. And we see a risk of this really weakening Sweden's future development research and also the research space. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And the second part of the study are some means to enable the use of research-based knowledge, where we discussed both in the survey and we discussed in the focus groups what could be done to increase the use of research. So as Anna mentioned, time was mentioned as the main hindering factor. So what to then do in order to gain more time or adopt changes to the perceived lack of time. And time is, of course, it's a priority. What is prioritized or valued within an organization, that's what workers put time on. We have the point 2 to 6 here are some means of kind of like how to gain time that we think. And one of them, the first one is on adapting research communication to policy and practice. Here, shorter papers, clear recommendations from researchers, but also seminars and doing communication in other ways. The third one is then strengthened support from management and funders. It was a clear tendency that workers said that this is maybe not so much valued by management and funders or prioritized, so simply prioritize it more. Fourth one, to increase practitioners' skills for finding and using research. This was mentioned as one of the ways, and that training and how to actually find research articles and how to read research and how to implement it in one's work could help out. Fifth, to strengthen direct access to research through networks. Many of the participants said that their contacts were based on individual contacts and that they didn't always know which institutes or networks to contact. So to make, not to have it so vulnerable contacts with just having one individual who might change work, but to have it more institutionalized contacts through networks. And the sixth here is to integrate research in development programming. This is something that many participants said that they would want researchers to be participating throughout development aid projects and programs and following the whole program cycle and thereby getting very direct access to researchers. So our conclusions and recommendations are very much in line with the enabling factors that I mentioned. First one, to bridge the communications gap between research and some practitioners by shorter, easier articles, but then also by the practitioners learning how to search and how to use research. Co-create research and development initiatives. As said in the previous, to have researchers connected directly to development cooperation programs. And the third one is in regards to what Anna was saying on this tendency that that we tend to use more internationally based research. We do think that there's a very, which we think is very important and should be continuously valued. However, to also institutionalize some of the contacts in between researchers, policymakers and practitioners in Sweden. And the fourth one here, to change incentives and structures for funding to improve our ways of working towards Agenda 2030. And this one refers to, well, having funded programs and the perceived lack of, like, there is no how to do it in actually. So changing the incentive structures and funding structures to work together and to increase the use of research in policymaking. So thank you. Those were our was shortly the study, and here are some contact details to SweDev. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna and Janet, for that excellent presentation. I think the findings of the study were really clear, and we hope we get a lot of questions from the audience as we move through this seminar. We have a great suggestion from Patrick at SIDA. Thank you for that. You know, we don't have time to introduce ourselves, but it is a good option to rename yourself in the participant list, so we can at least see, you know, where people are from. So if you feel comfortable with that, please do that. Thank you again so much. We have invited a distinguished panelist or discussant to kick off the discussion on the paper. And I would like to invite then Gunnel Axelsson Nykander. Gunnel is a policy advisor at ACT Church of Sweden and has kindly agreed to give a few reflections on the study and kick off the discussion. So Gunnel, over to you to share your reflections. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and really thank you for inviting me. First, I should say that I did not participate in the study. The director of my organization did, but when I read it, I could see that I recognize everything, and I agree on most. But I will start to share a few examples of research that we have been and are involved in ACT Church of Sweden. The first one has to do with practice, and it's a local to global protection project, which we do together with Dan Church Aid and ODI, and it's about humanitarian response. And it started up with community-based studies on how survivors themselves react, act, and experience support that they get from outside. And based on that, a new method called, or an approach, it's not a method, it's an approach called survivor and community-led response has been developed, and it puts a lot more power and resources in the hands of the local communities. So it's been quite successful. It's now, you know, got a lot of attention in the humanitarian community, and it's also taught at the university in Bochum in Germany. The other research that I would like to mention is something that we're doing right now. I'm not sure with whom actually. I think it's with consultants, but it's research in the sense that we are finding new information about religious family laws, on which there's very little research being done. And it's an issue that has immense impact on gender justice. And the other issue on policy is on social protection, which we started work on some more than 10 years ago. And at that time, we worked together with the Africa Institute, Nordic Africa Institute, and together we produced a publication, which was the first time this issue was sort of presented as a development issue in the Swedish context. But at that time, apart from Göran Holmqvist, who is now at SweDev, but was the Africa Institute at that time, we did not find any development researchers interested in working on these issues in Sweden, which we found very peculiar, since welfare policy would be, you know, flagship issue for Sweden, even in research. We did find researchers, social policy researchers like Joachim Palme, Kenneth Nelson, and others, who we have had some good cooperation with, and their research was very, very useful for us and still is. However, we also understood that they were not really easily included in the so-called development research community. So a question from that is really, can we today in a world, in an Agenda 2030 world, where we cannot say there is developed and developing countries, what is then development research? Isn't there a need not only to bridge the gap between practitioners and researchers, but also development research and other research? So that's, I guess, is a question to the authors and SweDev. But I would also give a few reflections on these examples that I gave. And one comes back to the conclusion in the report that research is used to confirm one's perspective rather than to inform decision-making. And I think that's true to some extent, but my experience would be that rather research is used at least with the local to global example, I think it was used to test an hypothesis that local people know better than international NGOs what they need. And they tested it, and based on that, they have developed the methodology. And also on social protection, I think when we started the work, we had an idea that this is an important topic, but we were very open on the how issues. Today, 10 years later, and many reports and work we've done, we have much more firm positions on the how issues. But I think research does influence the way how we think, at least on the approaches and so forth. And finally, the recommendations, I agree with all of them, and especially the one on cooperation, I think is very interesting. And it's really obvious if you think about it, development cooperation is process, it's about long-term relationships, hopefully, and it should be something that is more relevant for researchers who do long-term projects rather than consultants that come in and make short-term evaluations. And right now, when I think my organization, many others, we are struggling with the issues of decolonizing aid and changing the way we relate to partnership to our partners, and shifting power. And I think those processes would be very interesting to cooperate with researchers to get some to learn more about how these processes work. So I think my time is over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gunnel, for those insights and very, very important reflections. I'd like to give Anna and Janet an opportunity to reflect on the reflections, or at least comment on them. There were a few things that came directly to you. Maybe this issue of co-creation, I would also be particularly interested in following up. So Janet or Anna, who wants to start?
Thanks, I can start, and maybe Anna can. I think, yes, first you asked the question on what does SweDev mean with development research, and we have a very open view on what is development research in the study, and also on our website. We kind of tell to that you can yourself, if you can self-define yourself. If you believe that you are a development researcher, then you're welcome to participate in the network. And also in the study that we did on towards researchers, we had then 578 researchers actually that they believe that I'm doing development research. So it's then research somehow connected to development processes, and mostly in development countries, but it could also be developing processes in northern countries, and so we don't define that for them. So we have a very open, all disciplines, different perspectives on development research. And then you mentioned something interesting, or when you mentioned who you were cooperating with in these projects. Thanks for a very interesting examples. But you mentioned ODI, and then you mentioned consultants, and I think that that's also the picture we kind of got in the study, that that it's international actors, but then also consultants, that the organizations tend to contract consultants rather for studies. And it's a pity, we believe, since researchers, as you said, that could have this very much longer term perspective on things, that consultants typically come in in a short for short contracts and so, but researchers could have a longer perspective and dig deeper into questions. Maybe Anna, do you want to add something more on what Gunnel said?
Yeah, I can add. Thank you, Gunnel, for very interesting points, and great to hear more examples as well on how research is used and the difficulties. And one thing you mentioned was how you had actually tried to find a Swedish affiliated researcher to work with, but that was difficult, and that very much is in line with the findings that we had, that it is difficult to find researchers affiliated to Sweden even though you're really making the effort for it. And we hope that the recommendations that we give in the study for example, more co-creation of research, but also development initiatives can help this, as it would strengthen really the links to researchers and the research community, in turn probably making it easier for future initiatives as well to reach out to someone who is part of that research community and making that step smaller. So thank you for that. And I think otherwise that was my only comment, others than that Janet mentioned.
Yeah, just adding on that to Anna's, that we on the SweDev website, our SweDev's ambition is to kind of do support in this matchmaking of finding a researcher. So the registry that Jesper mentioned in the beginning, now we have 160 researchers registered there, but there is it's categorized. So if you kind of like want to find a gender researchers in Tanzania, you would be able to like scroll there and find, okay, these are the 5 names I got from it. So for practitioners participating now in this seminar, please do use our registry. It's not perfect yet. There's some things on the website and so that are not functioning well, but you can really use the registry and try to find researchers. So.
All right, thank you so much. I will do a virtual applause for Gunnel. Thank you for your contribution, and hope you will stay with us for the rest of this seminar as well. We have a question in the chat. Maybe somebody could answer off the cuff. How many in your network are both researchers and consultants? Do you know that, Janet? Do we know that? No.
No, we wouldn't know that.
Okay, so we can maybe get back to that. I know there's a bunch of them, myself included, who definitely do both work in both these spaces. We have another question, which I think is very good for actually discussing in the chats, from Rune Andersson at Gothenburg University, about students doing field studies as part of their master thesis. So have a look at that question and feel free to discuss it in the chat. I think it could work well as a discussion between participants attending. But again, thank you so much, Gunilla. We will move over soon to today's panel discussion, but before that, I would like to turn to you, all the participants here. And while we listen to the panelists and the reflections, we would like to ask for your input on how we can strengthen collaboration between research and practice. So in the chat, you will soon find a link to a Menti where you can click on, and you will be asked to share your best suggestions for how to do this. So at the end of the panel, we will come back and review what suggestions have come in. So really take this opportunity to contribute to the discussion and try to be creative about new ways of increasing collaboration, exchange between practitioners and researchers. I know we have people working in academia here, many of them. We also have people working more with implementation. And I also know that we have people who have done both or are still doing both. So I'm sure we can get many, many good suggestions. So please take that opportunity, and the link is now in the chat. You click that, and then you enter that 8-digit code on your website, on your browser. So hopefully that will give us a lot of good contributions. And in the meantime, we will move over to a panel discussion where we will pick up some of the questions and findings raised in this. And for the panel, I will invite 4 distinguished panelists. We will have Christina Hartler, who is the head of policy support unit at SIDA. Welcome so much, Christina, and thank you for joining us today. We will have Per Trulsson, who is a deputy director at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Per, glad to have you here. You have also worked at the Swedish Expert Group for AIDS Studies, I know, so have experience from different parts. We have Magnus Valan, who is a senior policy advisor at Diakonia. Most welcome, Magnus. So happy to have you with us today. And then finally, we will have Janet Vähämäki of SweDev also joining the panel. So welcome up on our virtual stage, Christina, Per, Janet, and Magnus. I would like to kick us off by asking a question to you, Christina, coming from SIDA. When you hear this and this study and the findings, what are your reflections on the findings of the study, and how would you say that they correlate with your own experiences as head of the policy support unit at SIDA?
Thank you so much, Jesper, and all of you for inviting me to this extremely interesting seminar. I'm so happy to be part of it, to the discussion. My experience from having worked in the research and in two international organizations as well as a government agency, SEDA, the report very much correlates with my own experiences. But let me just start by saying the obvious. I mean, aid is based on knowledge, and relevant and effective development assistance, it must be based on the current state of knowledge on various issues. So in other words, SEDA obviously needs research and evidence. So thus, a few years back, we identified learning and knowledge as one of our key areas where we needed to step up and improve our work. It related to leadership, it related to culture, and it also related to knowledge management systems as such. So based on these three pillars. And it's about a leadership that encourages and requests way of working that enable learning both internally and externally. And that we built the culture and leadership founded in curiosity and where learning and knowledge is prioritized. And it's asked for by management and leaders, and it's shared. And it's about develop working methods and adaptive organizations based on experience from evaluations, science, and other evidence. And finally, that we have system and processes that enable us to easily access, find, and absorb knowledge. Just to give you, I mean, how do we use research at SEDA? Just to give you a few examples, we acquire knowledge in a variety of ways and for different reasons. When we conduct multidimensional poverty analysis, for example, we depend on research to indicate the scope of the problem and its underlying causes. And when we evaluate proposals, we depend on partners to use relevant research to highlight the specific issues to be addressed in that specific intervention and why their proposed methods of addressing this issue will be effective. So there are a number of different situations where we need and where we use research. But what can we do to increase the use of research and evidence in development assistance? A key topic for today. As I mentioned, I think that the report, the findings report, very much correlates with my experience in general. But if I would say that the three priority actions, I would rate them as number one would be that it's about management asking and requesting clear quality requirements expressed by the political management at the ministry and asking also the management that's a government agency and also the management at NGOs. This can contribute both to stronger quality enhanced formal structures, but also promotes a culture of knowledge appetite. Second top action, in my view, is the recruitment process. To have postgraduate studies or experience from international organizations as a merit or a requirement. I think this is really a key action. And the third last action, if I would just mention the three top actions, would be a more systematic exchange between the research community. For example, develop forms of exchange between academia and the policy spheres, such as exchanges where researchers work for a time in the bureaucracy and employees for a period of time advance in academia. Another example in that area would be implementation research, which we use, but we could use even more. It's a useful way of determining the effectiveness of the program that we found. May I just highlight also two areas which I maybe don't agree with the conclusions in the report, or I think one of the conclusions which is highlighted also in the executive summary and that was highlighted here in the presentation is the insufficiency of time. In my view, it's rather the lack of management requesting, lack of management asking. I mean, what management asks for is usually what is being done. So in my view, it's another factor, another underlying factor that it's not really the time per se, in my view. We also did quite recently a huge survey where we asked all of our program managers, so several hundreds, and time was not really a key factor in our survey when we looked at these aspects. And the second recommendation in the report, which I do not agree with either, is that there's a tendency to use research-based knowledge produced in other countries. I guess what kind of share, how should, I mean, if we look at the share of Swedish produced research as a share of total global research, I think that we tend to overuse Swedish research rather than vice versa. So it's, I think we have to look at the global perspective, and that we're a small country. We should, of course, develop links and use the Swedish research produced, but we have to take into account the global perspective in that sense. So I would disagree with that conclusion as well. But otherwise, it's really a very interesting report, and I'm so looking forward to discussing it further. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those opening words, Christina. I tended to agree when I read that, there's never a lack of time. It's just because you choose to do other things. And it probably relates on what you said, that point about management asking and requesting this information. I will turn to you, Per, also representing more the policy side. What are your reflections hearing the findings and also the comments from Christina?
Well, having been a researcher myself, and I've also been working with the expert group of AIDS studies, these issues are not really new to me. I mean, these issues come up now and again. Of course, that's a reflection of them being difficult to address. We need to battle with how do we make research come relevant and important for how we develop our policies. And as you know, the policy framework is very strong on this fact that we need to have analysis, and we have to have experiences that we learn, and we have to have this reflected in our policy development and the way that we do development aid and the way we do humanitarian assistance. I'm very familiar with all these recommendations and conclusions that you come up with, Janet and Anna, and I believe you're right in most cases. Of course, there's always nuances to all of these things, some of which Christina has pointed out. I think to me, being in the political sphere, an important issue is about time, really. We move in a political environment where things happen very quickly. New developments happen very quickly. Like I've been working now with Asia and the Pacific during the last few years. In February, we had a coup in Myanmar, which had dramatic implications for how we worked and how we prioritized our work. Now in August again, we had Afghanistan, where the Taliban took over again, which had major repercussions on how we work. These things are difficult to foresee. And when you want to be policy relevant, it's very difficult to be in the short-term environment where we work. Of course, there are other ways in which you can become more policy relevant, and that is, of course, linking up to the longer-term processes. And that was one of the issues we discussed at the EBA. For example, being relevant to the strategy work of the government. When the government develops a new strategy for a particular country or for a particular theme, we of course do a lot of groundwork to inform ourselves of what the important issues are and how we can address them and how we can guide SweDev in its work on these particular topics. But of course, then you also have to be familiar with how the government works. If we are supposed to have a new strategy for a particular country at the end of this year, that process started more than a year ago. So if you're going to have a study of some sort, so research that's going to complement that study, inform that work, you really have to get involved more than a year prior to that. So that's one thing. It's also a matter of understanding how politics works. And that's, I guess, part of this thing, to understand how researchers work and how practitioners work. And some of us do, some of us don't. Another issue, I think, is about availability of research. When I worked at the EBA, we tried to define how do we reach the practitioners or the people at the ministry or SweDev. They will not read research just as that. They would need normally some kind of policy briefs, not more than 1 or 2 pages at the most. And it has to be relevant to what they work with. So you really have to be very targeted with what you do if you're going to go through, come through with that work. And that also requires an understanding of the processes and where the ministry or where SweDev is in its work and what they need. Because we cannot sit and read research reports on something which might be relevant. We have too many other things to work with. So that time simply isn't there. And even if you kind of got the time to do that, the ministry is not structured in such a way that you can sit and read research reports on 20, 50 pages. There's some particular instances where that might be possible, but in most cases not. So that's a reality.
If I may interrupt, would you say that the ministry is sufficiently asking for, you know, when SweDev produces a basis for a new strategy on the request of the ministry, would you say that the ministry is requesting that to be evidence-based sufficiently and taking into account research and evidence?
I would think so, and well, I have to ask Christina if that is a message they have, but yeah, I would believe that. And my understanding is also SweDev is an expert authority, and I would expect an expert authority to also base their knowledge on scientific evidence. But of course, we give instructions to SweDev in this strategy process, where we ask them to give us guidance for new strategy on particular issues that they are working with, and that report that they give to us is of course informed of their experiences of work. They do some rather thorough, well, I would say research work, more or less research work, at least for the MDPAs, for example, the poverty analysis that they undertake in the strategy process. So I sense there's a lot of that involved. But maybe you should ask Christina if that is a message you get.
Thank you. I will thank you, Per, for those introductory reflections. And I think it came back to that issue of, you know, saying that we don't have enough time. So what do we prioritize, right? And to what extent can we prioritize this? Christina, I will allow you to come back, but not just now. I want to invite Magnus as a representative of civil society, at least in this discussion. What are your reflections listening to the presentation and the comments?
I'm thinking that both for research, but also for us in aid, working both with programs in the field and in policy, the basic question is for us, how relevant are we for the right holders, for the change process? That's where we start. And to our strategy of change, shifting powers, like Gunnel was talking about. I would also say that both the aid effectiveness and the development effectiveness agenda and principles, I think that they are based on research. So that is also a reference point for us. I think that we are encouraged by our managers to involve and invite research. I think that we have also a proven record that we have done that in Almedal and in roundtables and our meetings, etc. But then we invite researchers which could give us and highlight specific problems which our right holders, as we see it, have an interest as part of a change process. And of course, that is a kind of a limitation, but that's our starting point, because our starting point is not, involved research, but to enlightening us about possible different options. And sometimes it ends up, we don't know. We have to and that there are different choices. And we must recognize that as well. But maybe we need more research to make better choices. And I could give examples of that. But sometimes I would say that we as Diakonia, we also give priority, both where we put our time and our money, also in doing actually research. I mean, we have started and initiated institutions like SweDev, Fair Finance Guide. We give support to networks like Eurodad, who is doing research, maybe not on academic level and with peer reviews, etc., but are very concerned and doing a lot of emphasis on factual with references, etc. But then it is, of course, that is also political choices. And I think that the debate is not just about how to involve researchers, it's about where we should put our money support in this change process. For example, we know, like, and I need to mention that, as an institution like Fair Finance Guide, a very cheap and very small institution with a turnover about 1 million crowns, have difficulties of getting money, although that we know that the finance sector, they know the problems. They know what they need to be done, but the financial sector doesn't work like that. So they need incentives about politics. And if the government and SIDA is not able to fund an institution like that, I think then we do have a bit of a problem on priorities. Not time maybe, but it's priorities.
Thank you, Magnus. Thanks, very interesting. Janet, I would like to turn to you. You mentioned in your recommendations, one recommendation is co-creation of research and development initiatives. I have been on the other side. I worked for a few years at SIDA. We had many ideas along those lines. I found it very difficult at that time to actually make it happen. What are your thoughts on this, and how do you see that? What could that look like?
Yeah, thanks. No, yeah, I've also been on both sides, working practically and then on the research side, and I think specific how it could look like. I think we in the survey we received several responses where the participants said that, okay, this is done in other countries. And I, for example, Switzerland, I did an evaluation on their development aid, and they have an institute called NADEL who is connected to the SDC, who is the equivalent to SIDA. And they are directly, when a project arises, they connect to researchers. So NADEL helps them connect to researchers, and then they kind of get advice directly in the beginning of the project process, like, okay, what type of research exists, and thematic overviews are done, and so by researchers. So and the NADEL organizes training for the practitioners, and yeah, help with connecting throughout both thematic overviews, but also throughout the project cycle. So that is something, and I know that many other countries are working in that way. So that's something that we were envisaging, and also the participants in the survey were telling that yes, they saw that this could be a good approach. And I know that SIDA does fund, and Sweden, we do have some of those types of initiatives funded in projects, följeforskning or something similar. And but it's very randomly, and it depends really on one program officer maybe knowing about the research team working in that. So there's no type of like a program and systematic thinking on it in the current aid system. So that is maybe something we were proposing to develop something a little bit more systematic approach for that. Yes.
Thank you, Janet. I would like, Christina, would you like to share some reflections on that as well? Because I think it would be interesting to hear from the perspective of SIDA.
Yes, maybe I can just first mention what Per mentioned, just to pick up on that we need more of policy briefs and short summaries on that we can read and digest in an easier fashion. And I just fully agree with you that on Per, that's really a key area where we need to do more. We've done a lot actually during just the last 12 months or so. We've done a lot of work in my unit to collect and synthesize and distribute and make accessible research in an easy format. For all our program managers in the field and in Stockholm. So I think that's a really, really an important action to take. On the question also that you discussed, Jesper and Per, on the management level, and is it enough or not in terms of asking and demanding? In my personal view, I think we could do more, and I really think that's really one of the top actions, and maybe even number one action that I mentioned earlier. And it's something that we have in our operational plan identified as one of our areas where we could do more, and in terms of leadership and culture, knowledge management system, and asking for research, making sure that program managers use evidence and research in their design of interventions, etc. I think that's really a key action as well. On Janet's point on the implementation research, följeforskning, I think that's really something. It's really interesting what we're doing at the moment, and it's something that we could do more of, and even work more in a systematic way, as Janet mentioned.
Thank you, Christina. Do you want to respond to that as well, Per, or should I move forward?
I think you can move forward.
Okay. And Janet, please.
Yeah, no, just really on Christina's, I wanted to comment on that you saw the two problems in the survey, or that you didn't agree upon, and it's the first one on insufficient of time and lack of management asking. I fully support you on that, and that's actually what we're saying in the study as well, that it's a perceived lack of time, that people feel that, like, I don't have lack of time, but it's totally dependent on what is prioritized actually. So if management would kind of ask for that and demand that, okay, then that would be what we are prioritizing. And I just saw in the chat someone writing about what donors prioritize is compliance, and that was a very frequent response we got in the survey as well, or in the interviews, that yes, okay, it's important with research, we really believe it's important, however we are asked to do reports and comply and evaluations and matrices on the results and all that, so we don't have time to actually, and no one is actually asking for that. And then on this tendency to use international over Swedish research, I'm really happy to hear if that is your view on that. That this was also something we don't have like numbers on if that is actually true. It was just something that very many in the interviews were mentioning, that we asked like, who do you collaborate, it was mainly with international organizations, and not so many did know how to find Swedish research. So but happy to hear if that's you have a contrary view on that. Thanks.
Yes, Magnus, you raised your hand. That's a very effective way of getting my attention. Please.
I think that what was raised here in the end, I think that of course it is also a time factor, because it is a matter of what demands do we have as aid organizations on reporting, etc. Is there enough time to do the enough dialogue with the right holders, looking at choices, ask for research on different policy choices, yes, I do think it is a matter of resources and time, but not only. I would say that for a couple of years ago, we were asked the Diakonia, well, you stopped doing evaluations, the Swedish consultants told us. No, well, you don't come to us anymore. No, because we use local. We have the local evaluators. We work with the local universities, and you can find them in Spanish and etc. on our webpage. So that was a shift, a deliberate shift. I mentioned Finance Guide earlier, or Eurodad, but I could also mention a lot of networks in the South, where we give support to and have a collaboration with, who participate also in our discussions on policy choices, etc. Tax Justice Network, for example, and we try to link them to Swedish also decision makers. We had a seminar, Gunnel, I think you were there, also where the former Minister of Finance, Magdalena Andersson, was part in the debate. So that's how we also try to link research and factual reports to our work in, not just in aid, but in the debate about development effectiveness.
Thanks, Magnus. And for those who have missed it, she is now our Prime Minister. Since maybe
that's why minutes. I said former.
Thank you so much. I would like to. There's a question in the chat about how can researchers become more relevant, and in my experience, as a researcher, we're very good at asking questions, but I also feel that it's not necessarily the same question that those working with implementation grapple with at the same time. And that doesn't mean that these questions are unrelated. But when I think, listening to you, Magnus, and the work that civil society do, you more often have maybe a better ear to the ground on what policymakers are grappling with at the moment than most academicians do. And first of all, would you agree that we're struggling with different questions? And secondly, can maybe civil society even play a mediator role in bridging that gap?
Do you want me to answer? I could say, for me, definitely yes. And I think that we have to find new ways and tools to involve researchers in the development and policy choices that we have. When we have discussions on the next coming strategy for Zimbabwe, for example, we linked up Swedish politicians with Zimbabwean research organizations, with civil society, churches, and Swedish academia in the policy debate, in roundtables. We had 2 of them. And that's one way, but then it's also to know what's going on and to know what's being done. So I think it's a good idea to have these new platforms and increase dialogue to find new methods. I welcome that.
Thank you. Per, can I turn to you and ask, would you agree with what I said, that there is that gap in what questions are being asked?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the communication issue that we're talking about, knowing each other's environments and the situation that we're working in. Somebody in the chat mentioned that when you research, you need to be published and you need to have your citations. But that doesn't matter when you work in the ministry, of course. Then there are different issues that matters. So for a researcher to spend time on doing policy briefs, etc., then you have to have another incentive, so to say, to do that, I guess. Because the researcher's time is after all also limited, I guess, even though we work with longer term horizons. But if you want to be a relevant researcher, you need to be on the researcher platforms and researcher forum. So that's when you're straddling the policy and the research areas, that where the incentives have to be right and you have to have the right resources to do so. And I guess this is where the territory where we're trying to find out how can we get those closer to each other, given the restraints that we have in terms of both in terms of the resources and work tasks.
Great, thanks, Pat. We're coming to the end of the time for the panel, but I would like, before we let you guys go, that you would give us then, of all these choices and possibilities that we have and the good intentions, what is your number one recommendation for how we can improve the linkage between policy and research? And I'll start with you, Christina.
Oh, do I have to just pick one?
Yes, you have to pick one, and I'm sure we get other suggestions from the mentees.
But I already mentioned this, it's sort of a more systematic change with the research community. And I think that could be done in so many different ways. That you could do exchanges where researchers work for a time in the bureaucracy and vice versa. And this implementation research, I think, is also extremely useful. But there's so many more other things to do as well.
So let's stop there and allow for the other colleagues to also give suggestions. Okay. Magnus.
I think that both for research and for us in the aid organizations, we have to be better on listening to ear to the ground and to start from there to make us relevant. And I'm talking both the aid organization as well as researchers. So that is my priority number one.
Great, thank you. Per, can I ask you for your top one recommendation?
I would say that we need a bit more creativity and perhaps more of an entrepreneurial spirit also among in the research community. We were saying before that we don't use Swedish research as much as we should, and Christina, of course, addressed that. But I think what we try to do is to use the best available research there is, and we're on an international arena. So it's quite obvious that we will work with research coming from other places in the world, especially now that we can use the internet like this and have webinars across the world. We don't have to be confined to meeting in physical rooms somewhere in Gustav Adolfs Torg, wherever we are. And I think there are good examples of how we have managed within the Swedish research community to make ourselves renowned and in the international scene, and also how we established fora that are relevant also to ministry. I'm talking, for example, about Gothenburg University and Varieties of Democracy, which has in a short time actually managed to put themselves on the map for international renowned research. And something that we also look at quite closely and that we follow, which of course pertains to them having identified a niche on democracy, which is one of the key themes and top priorities for our policy work. Another example is CPRI, who has an annual forum where you get researchers and practitioners together to discuss issues of importance to, I guess, both groups, and where I think they've managed to create a very useful format to have those interactions. So to try to find that kind of creativity in how we make research and practitioners meet and package it appropriately.
Thank you so much, Per. Janet, final suggestion from you.
Thank you. No, I think I agree with all of you, so I take them to mind. But I think having a longer term vision for how to, because there's of course a lot to be done on, like, okay, the researchers to be more innovative and so on, and for those types of initiatives to raise, then you need funding, like Magnus was saying. Okay, here is a very good initiative, but then you need funding in order to kind of like survive, and you need the ability to kind of like be able to think about it in a longer term perspective. And it's the same situation where SweDev is now. We have like 6 months on us now to like prove that we are doing something, and then we don't have financing any longer. So it's kind of, in order to continue doing this work, it's of course important to have some type of a longer term perspective and a longer term strategy in order to actually show that there is something here. And so it doesn't, so long-term strategy and funding, prioritizing and making it that creativity can actually grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you to the panel. I'll do my virtual clap again. Please stay on. There might be, reasons to come back to you in the final minutes here. We might get questions from the audience, so you will stay in the spotlight. But I would like to turn to Jonathan and Alice at the Secretariat to see where we are with the Menti. What has come up there?
Yeah, we have gotten several really good suggestions in the Menti, and my colleague will now also post these results in the chat. One suggestion that seems to be very common is that researchers should focus on strategic communication and focus on not focus on individual papers. There's also a need for research to be communicated in a more simple manner. Policy briefs or other 1 to 2 pages, it's more than enough for practitioners, and anything longer than that is really hard to use. Some suggestions ask if we could integrate research in the early stages of development programs, but also the other way around. Can practitioners be part of the research processes? And for this to happen, there's also a need for joint funding to help these ideas. And then, of course, like what we have discussed here, networks, forums, and hubs for knowledge sharing, such as SweDev, is also raised as important for greater collaboration. And these networks also need to receive a greater acknowledgement for their work and role in this bridging. And there's also suggestion to integrate researchers in the development of the strategies and goal in the development cooperation, and how could we do that better. And then finally, we have a suggestion to develop a roster of researchers, or perhaps use the already existing help desks at SIDA and develop those further. But you can see the full list now posted in the chat as well.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for that summary. Let me pause a bit on this integrate research in the strategy process. My own field is global health, you could say, and in my experience, it's quite a vibrant network in global health, very much led and run by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in sort of gathering people there, and also being extremely inclusive in strategy processes generally. But I'm not sure if that's maybe an exception rather than the rule, or so, what can we do to sort of have that more institutionalized across different thematic fields? Maybe Christina, I see you nodding, so I'm going to give the word to you.
Yes, no, but thank you so much, Jesper. I think that's very interesting. So my division, we're some 30 staff covering 15 thematic areas. One of the things that we in my division is that we're responsible for our thematic networks, i.e. combining all staff working on different thematic areas. So everyone working on health in our 35 foreign missions, also at our Stockholm-based portfolios, we work together with learning and knowledge and evidence and knowledge management, etc. And among all these networks, the health one is the best example, maybe, in sense of working closely with the research community and having a vibrant network. So I think that we can all also learn from the health network and how you work and how you draw and how you interact with the research community. sort of the sharing best practice between the different thematic areas. So that was just a reflection. It was interesting that you mentioned the health network, health and SRHR network for us. Thank you.
Per, do you have any reflections from the perspective of the ministry on this, and if you discuss it internally, or how you can work with networks like this?
I think it's pretty much the same thing. I mean, we also have our networks. For instance, me working at a geographical department, when we develop a new strategy for, let's say, Afghanistan, we have a group of NGOs that work specifically with Afghanistan that we, well, on an annual or biannual, semi-annual basis interact with. And then we use that as a way of getting input and then discuss issues of relevance to the strategy. So that's also how we work. Our networks may be slightly different, but I think mostly they intersect, I guess called.
Magnus, can I turn to you and maybe ask the question in a bit different way? I know you're a very active person in the policy debate, and I'm sure you sort of, if not invited, you make sure to get into those policy processes which you find important, and maybe you have some pieces of advice for researchers not as savvy as Diakonia or other CSOs.
I would say that some of the processes in choices for both aid effectiveness and development effectiveness, we are invited as CSOs. I would like to see maybe also academia. I would like to see representatives of right holders earlier in the processes. For example, in the country strategies, there could be difficult choices which are not really always well in advance. Could be, you know, the involvement and take out different directions for strategies. It could be also thematic strategies, etc., where one earlier in the process could invite other stakeholders, so to say.
Great, thank you. And Sarah Thompson from SweDev is adding in the chat about the works of the help network, which it seems could maybe serve a bit as a role model for other thematic networks or even geographical networks. Time is flying, so let's open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. A few things have been flying by in the chat. I have not been able to fully pick up everything going on, but also please raise your hand if you want to have the floor and ask a question to the panel, to the authors, or to the group of participants here that you would like to have discussed. Let me see if there are any hands up. Don't be shy. We still have 8 people on the call. There must be a few more questions than those just coming through the chat. If not, maybe Jonathan, in the meantime, can you help me pick something up from the chat that could be worthwhile building on?
Yeah, but we had a question from Rune Andersson, who asked, he said that in his view, it was a mistake to close the research department SAREC at SIDA. Could it be reestablished?
Well, there is a research department still at SIDA, but I'll allow for Christina to reflect on SAREC maybe.
I'm maybe not really the right person. I haven't worked in SAREC, but we have, as you mentioned, Jesper, we have today a vibrant, very effective research division. And also I put something in the chat about EBA, which I think has been very useful for us and building the bridge. And I think we can use EBA and work even closer with EBA than we do at the moment.
What Rune might have been alluding to is the fact that you moved the development research funding out of SIDA to the National Research Council. Janet, you're flagging your hand.
Yeah, no, this is something we mentioned in the other EBA report I mentioned in the beginning, on where we looked at the research community and did a survey for researchers and also the historical views. And where also we as authors, SweDev, thought that it was some type of a pity, or that we have lost this someone who actually kind of holds the hand of like the Swedish research community and these connections and so, because it's true that historically there were much more opportunities for researchers to be connected to development cooperation practice and during SAREC's time. And that was in 2013 when the grant for that was moved to Swedish Research Council, to Vetenskapsrådet, and SIDA's mandate was then purely to work with research cooperation in the South. Then this kind of like being a missing, there's no one who's actually had that responsibility, or actually it is with the Swedish Research Council at the moment, that they are not involved in development cooperation as such. So that's maybe some explanation on how this link on actually linking researchers directly to development cooperation practice has kind of like disappeared. So that has been our view as well, and we write about this in the other EBA study. And we have been promoting that there's something more should be done on this, like in this study, that we hope that this is something that will end up in the next research strategy, for example.
Magnus, please.
I was just thinking, I think I mentioned, there are different kind of organizations, like, that are doing research with specific topics which are close to the right holders. I mentioned the Tax Justice Network Africa, but I could also mention these organizations that are working on debt and development in different parts of the world. And I think that to link Swedish academia with these institutions and secure that their voices are also part and their experiences, their research is also used. I think that's an important, there are possibilities there are, for cooperation, etc. As things to learn.
A colleague of mine expressed it very well, I think, when he said, we have less than 10 years to meet the Agenda 2030 goals. We can't spend 2 years writing applications and wait for another 2 years for the articles to come out. So I also, that sort of sense of urgency of being able to respond more quickly. And it relates to a question that we got on how could science information demands from the government be expressed in a way that science can respond to? How do we practically organize this? And I think it goes back to that question of, the questions that you are asking from an implementation perspective, and how do we link that to the questions that we as academicians are trying to scientifically respond to? Can we have a few more reflections on that, maybe from Per or Christina? We have a couple of suggestions with the networks, but there might be other ideas of how we can strengthen that divide.
Maybe I think there's been many suggestions already mentioned, but maybe just, in order for research to be relevant, for SIDA, it has to be context specific and focus on the poorest and the most marginalized. That's an aspect we haven't touched upon so far. But maybe Per would have something to add on this.
Well, I think the question is perhaps more relevant to the thematic areas than the geographical ones. But I'm thinking climate and environment, where we've seen a lot of interaction between researchers and policymakers in the last number of years. Maybe there are some lessons to be learned from that kind of interaction, where the researchers, in fact, have had large influence on how the political discussion has developed and what kind of responses have been produced.
Let me share an own experience, because I'm working with a project in Zambia, a lower middle income country, where we are evaluating the national health insurance reform. And that's a reform targeting the entire population, of course. But exactly as you say, Christina, the focus is on the poorest and the most vulnerable. And they're part of this, of course. But we can sense that it becomes a bit more difficult to have the donor community interested in our work because we're looking at something which is not the most poverty focused. And sometimes I can feel that becomes a bit challenging when we're trying to look more holistically. And also as countries that are moving, out of poverty, maybe part of our work become, not irrelevant, but less interesting from the combating poverty perspective. Would you agree, or am I out losing it completely?
No, I think that sounds reasonable. Absolutely, that's one challenge. But it's also very important to look at the strategies that are decided by the government and what kind of areas. We have the context specific, we have the poorest and the most marginalized, but we also have to look to map the thematic areas by strategies, and that changes every year. We have new strategies, we have new countries, we have new sub-thematic areas. So that's maybe an information issue also.
Yeah, thanks. Gunnel, you have raised your hand, please.
Yes, and thank you. And it's actually because the example you had from Zambia, I think illustrates very well the point I made about social protection and the relevance of Swedish experiences and Swedish social policy, because exactly the point that we have been now actually fighting SIDA for quite a few years is that we say that the poverty targeting, which most donors promote, is actually not pro-poor, because the targeting methods are absolutely inaccurate, and they're not also building the kind of social cohesion and social contract and inclusion. And we just have to look at the history of Sweden, where we started the universal social pension 100 years ago, and how that includes and why we have the universal child grants, the whole experience of that. It's not about designing effective development projects, which makes the most value for money in those development aid. The question is about how do you support the development of a society, and then it's not about development research. It's about research and what are the processes, and it's about political economy. It's about social processes and whether people get lazy when they get benefits or not. I mean, that's the same questions we have and had for ages in our country. So I think you just illustrate the point, and I have been so puzzled that the sort of history of our own country have been forgotten when people get their development aid hats on and go out in the world. And sorry for being very blunt, but this is really my close to my heart. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Gunnel. We're coming to a close. It's 11:24. I will look at the panel. Raise your hand, wave, nod, do something to catch my attention if you want to have a final word in relation to Gunnel's comments or the other things that have come up. Otherwise, I think we're going to move to closing this session. Anybody want to say a final word? You can shake your head as well if you're done, if you feel. All right. Thank you so much again to the panel. Let's do the virtual applaud. I like it as a means of expressing our gratitude. Thank you for taking time. Thank you for your insights, and really, we really appreciate that you wanted to be part of this discussion. All right, and I see, sorry? No, it was just a way. With that, we are drawing to a close. We're coming to the end of this seminar. I would like to thank the authors. We thank the panel, but also all the people who have attended this session today. I see people are gradually dropping off, which is what happens. We have received many good suggestions for how to move forward and improve interaction, exchange, collaboration between development researchers and practitioners. And improving this is sort of SweDev's raison d'être. That's why we exist. And we will continue to work on this. We will continue to work with SIDA, with the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, with the researchers and all the other stakeholders to carry forward and see what we can do with the important issues and the suggestions from today. So with that, we thank you for taking time to join today's seminar. Please, if you haven't signed up at our website, we really encourage you to do so. And if you have already, thank you for that. And yes, that's it. We close today's seminar. Thank you for participating and have a lovely, great rest of the day. Thank you.